When did the entire space industry quietly bet everything on one company? I honestly couldn't tell you. There wasn't a single historic launch, no official announcement, no moment when governments stepped aside. But when I looked at how launches actually happen today, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Commercial satellites, NASA astronauts, national security missions, different customers, different missions, the same launch provider. Somewhere along the way, the center of the space industry had quietly shifted. Most of us just didn't notice when it happened, which left me with a much bigger question. How did the company almost nobody expected to survive become the company everyone was quietly planning around? The obvious explanation was that SpaceX had always been the favorite. That turned out to be completely wrong. If you go back to the beginning, almost nobody expected this company to become the center of the industry. In the early years, the idea itself sounded unrealistic. A privately funded startup wanted to compete against companies that had spent decades building rockets for the United States government. Those companies already had the contracts. They already had the experience. They already had the trust. SpaceX had almost none of those things. Even reaching orbit was not something people assumed would happen. Before Falcon 1 finally succeeded, failure was considered the more likely outcome. Not because people disliked the company, because history was not on its side. No privately funded startup had broken into an industry dominated by established government contractors. And even after SpaceX proved it could reach orbit, that did not suddenly make it indispensable. NASA did not behave as though it had found its future champion. It continued working with multiple providers. Human spaceflight certification remained an enormous hurdle. Legacy aerospace companies still controlled most government launch business. The idea that one startup would eventually become the backbone of American access to space simply was not how anyone expected the story to unfold. That was what kept bothering me. If almost everyone agreed this company was the outsider, what was the first thing that made people start changing their minds? The first answer seemed obvious. Build a better rocket. That was how every space race had worked before. A better vehicle wins more missions. Except that was not what I kept finding. The real turning point was not simply that Falcon reached orbit. It was what happened after the mission ended. Instead of falling into the ocean like almost every orbital rocket before it, the first stage turned around and came back. At first, that looked like nothing more than an astonishing engineering achievement. The videos spread everywhere. People celebrated the landing itself, but the landing was never the real discovery. The real discovery was what happened next. The same booster flew again. Then it flew again. Before long, launching a flight-proven booster no longer felt unusual. It became routine. By early 2026, more than 540 Falcon missions had been completed using previously flown boosters. More than 570 successful booster recoveries showed that landing was no longer an experiment. Recovery had become the normal way SpaceX operated. That changed the economics of launch in a way I had completely underestimated. The most expensive part of the rocket no longer disappeared after a single mission. Recover it, refurbish it, fly it again. Suddenly, frequent launches were not just possible, they were practical. For the first time, I understood why people had started looking at SpaceX differently. It was not simply because Falcon could reach orbit. It was because every successful landing meant the next launch no longer had to begin from scratch. That felt like the first real crack in the old system. But it also raised another question. If reusable boosters really changed everything, Why did everyone else not simply build the same thing? At first, I thought reusability was the entire answer. Recover the booster, refurbish it, launch it again, repeat the process. The more I looked, the less convincing that explanation became. A reusable rocket does not transform an industry by itself. It only matters if it keeps flying. That was where the story changed again. Falcon 9 was not just being reused, it was flying constantly. Every mission added another successful launch, another landing, another set of real operational experience, another opportunity to improve the system before the next customer arrived. That pace created something competitors could not produce nearly as quickly. Experience, not experience from computer models, not experience from ground testing. Experience earned during real orbital missions. Falcon 9 became one of the most frequently launched rockets in history. Instead of waiting months between flights to learn what worked, SpaceX kept learning from mission after mission, week after week. Then another pattern started to appear. Customers were not simply buying a rocket. They were buying predictability. A company that launches only a handful of missions each year leaves very little room for delays. A company launching over and over again can adjust schedules, recover from setbacks, and keep missions moving. That makes planning easier. And easier planning attracts even more customers. More customers create a larger launch manifest. A larger manifest justifies building more boosters. More boosters support even more launches. The system keeps strengthening itself. By that point, I was no longer looking at a company with better engineering alone. I was looking at an operating model that became stronger every time another rocket left the launch pad. That made me wonder whether engineering had ever been the biggest advantage, or whether something much larger had been quietly driving the entire cycle from the very beginning. I kept coming back to one assumption. Surely governments were simply buying launches. Nothing more, but that was not what the evidence showed. Years before SpaceX became the dominant launch provider, NASA had already started changing something much bigger than its rockets. It changed the way it bought access to space. Instead of owning every transportation system itself, NASA began paying commercial companies to provide transportation as a service. At first, that meant cargo. Dragon spacecraft started carrying supplies to the International Space Station through NASA's Commercial Resupply Services program. The missions were not extraordinary. That was exactly the point. They became routine. Then the same idea expanded. Crew Dragon was not built for a single demonstration. It became part of NASA's regular crew rotation schedule. American astronauts were no longer flying only on transportation systems operated directly by the government. Routine human spaceflight had become a commercial service. The pattern did not stop there. As SpaceX demonstrated consistent performance, it also started receiving national security launch missions alongside its growing commercial business. Different customers, different missions. The same company kept gaining experience. That was when I realized I had misunderstood what these contracts were actually doing. NASA was not simply purchasing launches. Every completed mission gave SpaceX another opportunity to operate, another opportunity to refine its procedures, another opportunity to prove itself to the next customer. The contracts were not just paying for transportation. They were continuously feeding a system that became stronger with every successful flight. That made the shift feel much larger than a procurement decision. It raised another question. What happens when governments, commercial companies, and national security missions all begin depending on the same launch provider? Once I saw that pattern, I started noticing it everywhere. It was not just NASA. Commercial satellite companies were making the same decision. International customers were making it as well. Mission after mission appeared on the Falcon launch manifest. Not because customers had no alternatives. Because Falcon had become the option they could confidently build their schedules around. That distinction mattered. For years, access to space had been something customers hoped would stay on schedule. Now, they increasingly expected it. A satellite operator planning a constellation could organize an entire timeline around Falcon launches. NASA could schedule regular crew rotations, knowing Crew Dragon had become part of its operational rhythm. The expectation itself had changed. Then I noticed another consequence. SpaceX's competitors were not standing still. They were investing in reusable launch systems of their own. That alone revealed something important. The debate over whether reusability worked was already over. The industry had accepted the answer. The race had shifted. It was no longer about proving the idea. It was about matching the operating system that had grown around it. And that system extended far beyond the rocket itself. Customers expected frequent launch opportunities. Governments planned around existing availability. Commercial missions fit into an increasingly busy launch schedule. Every new customer reinforced that schedule. Every completed mission made the next booking a little easier. The center of gravity had quietly moved. Not because anyone officially declared SpaceX the leader, because thousands of independent decisions kept pointing toward the same company. That was the moment the story stopped feeling like a competition between rocket builders. It started feeling like an entire ecosystem reorganizing itself around one provider. That left one final mystery. Was all of this simply the result of years of success? Or was there another mechanism quietly making that success grow faster every single year? I kept looking for the moment the gap became impossible to close. There was not a single moment. Instead, I found something much harder to compete with. A self-reinforcing cycle. Every Falcon launch generated more than revenue. It generated experience. Engineers learned from another real mission. Refurbishment teams learned how to prepare boosters more efficiently. Launch crews refined procedures that could only be tested during actual operations. Every successful mission made the next one a little better. That growing experience produced something customers could not ignore. Confidence. Not confidence built on promises. Confidence earned through hundreds of successful missions, and confidence changes behavior. Customers who trust a launch provider are more likely to book another mission. New customers become more willing to join the schedule. The launch backlog grows. Capacity expands. Then the cycle begins again. The revenue from those missions did not simply reward past success. It financed the next state of growth. More manufacturing. More launch infrastructure. Continued investment in future vehicles like Starship. Every successful mission increased the company's ability to perform even more missions. That was when the entire picture finally came into focus. I had been searching for one decisive advantage. There was never just one. There was a system where every successful launch strengthened every other part of the business. More launches created more experience. More experience improved reliability. Greater reliability attracted more customers. More customers generated more revenue. More revenue expanded launch capacity. Expanded capacity enabled even more launches. Breaking a single part of that cycle would never be enough. A competitor would not simply need a rocket that worked. It would need to build an entire operating system capable of compounding in exactly the same way. That raised the biggest question of all. If this cycle continued reinforcing itself, could anyone realistically catch up? At that point, I assumed the rest of the industry would eventually close the gap. After all, the idea was no longer a secret. Everyone had watched Falcon boosters return to Earth. Everyone understood why reusability mattered. Given enough time, would every major launch company eventually reach the same place? The evidence kept pointing somewhere else. Reusability was never the finish line. It was only the starting point. A reusable rocket does not automatically create frequent launches. Frequent launches do not automatically create customer trust. Customer trust does not automatically create the backlog needed to expand manufacturing and operations. Those pieces have to grow together. None of them can replace another. That explains something I had completely misunderstood before. A competitor could build a rocket capable of landing. It could prove the technology worked. But if that rocket flew only occasionally, it would gain experience much more slowly. Customers would have fewer missions to evaluate. The launch manifest would grow more gradually. Investment would expand at a slower pace. Every part of the system would compound more slowly. The advantage was never protected by one invention. It kept growing because thousands of successful operations reinforced one another. The more launches SpaceX completed, the harder it became for lower cadence competitors to generate the same experience, the same confidence, and the same momentum. That was why catching up no longer looked like an engineering problem. It looked like an operational problem, one that required changing an entire competitive model rather than simply building a better rocket. Once I understood that, the opening question finally started answering itself. Maybe SpaceX did not become indispensable because it built the best rocket. Maybe it became indispensable because it changed what the entire space industry rewarded in the first place. There was only one piece left. If all of that was true, then what was SpaceX's real achievement? I started this investigation looking for a single breakthrough. One invention, one launch, one decision that changed everything. But every path led back to the same conclusion. There was never one turning point. Reusable boosters mattered. Lower launch costs mattered. NASA's procurement strategy mattered. Higher launch cadence mattered. But none of those developments explains today's reality on its own. What transformed the industry was the way each of those pieces reinforced the others. Reusability made frequent launches practical. Frequent launches accelerated operational learning. Operational learning improved reliability. Reliability attracted customers. Customer demand financed more infrastructure, more boosters, and greater launch capacity. Then the cycle started again. Not once, hundreds of times. That was why the industry looked completely different by the time I reached the present. Governments still build rockets. Traditional aerospace companies still launch missions. Space exploration never stopped belonging to national space agencies. That belief was never wrong. It was simply incomplete. The part almost everyone missed was that access to space quietly became an operational service. The company that mastered operating that service at unmatched scale gradually became the company everyone else started planning around. Not because it replaced governments, because it became the platform governments, businesses, and commercial customers increasingly relied upon to reach orbit. When I returned to the question that started this investigation, the answer no longer felt surprising. SpaceX did not become the center of the space industry by building the best rocket. It became the center by changing the operating system the entire industry now runs on. We all grew up believing governments built the space industry. For more than half a century, they did. That was never the part that changed. What changed was something much quieter. instead of asking who owned the rockets. The industry slowly began asking who could reliably carry people and payloads into orbit again and again. The answer kept pointing to the same company. Not because it replaced governments. Not because it invented every important breakthrough. But because it transformed orbital launch from an occasional achievement into a dependable service that governments, businesses, and commercial customers could confidently build their plans around. I started this story believing SpaceX succeeded by building better rockets. I finished it realizing something very different. The company that quietly became the center of modern spaceflight was not the one that built the best rocket. It was the one that changed how the entire space industry operates.